Buenos días and good morning. Bienvenido and welcome to the World Jurist Association's International Summit on the Rule of Law. My name is Kim Quarles, and I am the Executive Vice President of the World Jurist Association. As we heard yesterday, the mission of the World Jurist Association is to promote the rule of law as the guarantor of peace and freedom. And today, we are going to be discussing some very important legal issues. Our first panel today, the two roundtables, will focus on legal practitioners and current issues. The second panels, the remaining panels, will address issues facing judges and lawyers globally today. And there are many issues facing the constitutionality of laws today. Before we get into the introductions for panels, a couple of housekeeping matters, please. Please make sure your cell phones are turned to mute. And I will be making sure we have so many preeminent speakers and so much good information. I will be sitting in the audience maintaining a strict 5-minute rule for all speakers. I have cards. When you're at 3 minutes, 2 minutes, 0 minutes, I will stand up and I will ask the moderator of the panel to unfortunately interrupt. When the speaker on the screen is at 0 minutes, I will stand up and we will unfortunately have to break in. That will help us stay on track and be sure that all speakers have an opportunity to speak. So, the first roundtable this morning is about COVID-related regulations and their impact on citizens and investors. Joining us by video conference today are Fabiana Menichetti, Mark Northway, and Siphana. I'd like to now introduce Diego Solana, the program coordinator of the World Law Congress, who will introduce our guests who are here in person with us today. Diego, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kim. I'm delighted and very happy to be here today for two main reasons. The first one is because we've been yesterday talking a lot about the rule of law and a lot about justices and professors. But when you read Charles Ryan, the founder of the World Jurist Association book, his autobiography, and you read his conversation with Chief Justice L. Warren and Sir Winston Churchill, and that campaign about the rule of law and the promotion of the rule of law as an alternative, as the only alternative to tyranny, they also thought a lot about legal practitioners, how important legal practitioners are. We are really at the front line where people come when they are in pain, when companies go, when they think they've been victims of an abuse of power. So we are also very important, one of the pillars of the World Jurist Association, and we're also one of the pillars for the promotion of the rule of law. So I'm very happy to be here with so many international attorneys from UK, from USA, from Cambodia, from Italy, from Austria, and with this extraordinary network of legal practitioners, of attorneys from Eurolatam legs. The second reason why I'm also very honored and delighted to be here today is that this panel is about the main crisis world has suffered for 3 generations. Obviously, I'm talking about the pandemic. Since the Second World War, there has been no such a terrible crisis, so much pain, so much losses, so much suffering. And as I said before, what people did, a lot of times, they went to search for advice, search for help, search for assistance to legal practitioners. And I'm really looking forward to learn, to listen to my colleagues, to know how their countries, how their legislators, how their judges, how their public administrations has responded to this, unfortunately, still ongoing crisis. So I please call to the floor to the keynote speaker, Orlando Viera Blanco from Venezuela, Ambassador of Venezuela to Canada, David Kovel, U.S. Attorney, Managing Partner at Kirby and McInerney, Norman Hede Castro Campbell, Dominican Republic Attorney, Harald Czermak, Austria legal practitioner, our friends through video conference from Italy, UK, and Cambodia. So please, I invite you to come to the stage. Orlando, you're the keynote speaker, please.
Gracias.
Please stick to the strict rules announced by Kim Quarles, okay? So go ahead, Orlando, please.
Gracias. Bueno, muy buenos días. Hoy voy a tratar en 5 minutos de resumirles quizás una de las peores tragedias que sufre Venezuela en estos momentos, independientemente de la pandemia. Se trata de un holocausto ambiental, el peor ecocidio que quizás ha vivido la humanidad y que padece nuestro país. Hasta hace poco, un país llamado Venezuela contaba con 70% de energía híbrida limpia, contaba con la red hospitalaria más importante de Latinoamérica. Hasta hace poco, hasta hace 20 años, los venezolanos podían algo tan normal como tener agua en su casa, electricidad en su casa. Hoy el 80% de los venezolanos no tienen agua por lo menos 3 días a la semana y padecen de faltas de luz por periodos de 8 horas, al menos un día sí y un día no. Esto a pesar de contar con la tercera cuenca más importante de afluencia de agua de Sudamérica, que es la cuenca del Orinoco. La cuenca del Orinoco con 1 millón de kilómetros cuadrados de extensión, el equivalente a la extensión de nuestro país, que genera 10.000 litros por segundo, 10.000 mililitros por segundo en afluencia de agua. Venezuela en este momento tiene 663 minerías ilegales. Es centro de delincuencia, de tráfico de oro, es centro de castración, de mutilación y de trata de niños, de trata de mujeres, de trata de personas. Venezuela en este momento está siendo devastada en la región llamada el Macizo Guayanés, la reserva más antigua del planeta en cuanto a la reserva ecológica. 111.000 kilómetros cuadrados devastados por la minería irresponsable. Los niveles de mercurio que se encuentran en este momento en los pobladores indígenas es 5 veces lo que tolera el cuerpo en cuanto a los niveles en sangre y en el cuerpo. Es la devastación de nuestra cultura indígena, es la devastación del parque Imataca, donde se encontraban las fuentes hidroeléctricas más importantes del mundo. Este ecocidio, este holocausto ambiental, se combina con el COVID. Porque al fin de cuentas, en Venezuela la peor plaga que tiene no es el COVID. La peor plaga que tiene Venezuela, la peor pandemia, llegó hace algunos años y es inédita en Latinoamérica. Estamos hablando de un régimen que es una dictadura no convencional que ha devastado un país generoso, un país noble, un país decente, un país rico, que tiene las reservas más altas de petróleo del mundo, 300.000 millones de barriles, y hoy no tiene gasolina y hoy no tiene diésel para consumir. Me avergüenza mucho, siendo un venezolano que vivió y se aprovechó gratamente, como muchos de nosotros, de la mejor y más importante movilización social que ha tenido Latinoamérica en su historia. En los 60, 70 y 80, Venezuela fue el país de destino migratorio más importante del mundo y hoy tenemos 6 millones de venezolanos fuera de Venezuela, que es otro país fuera de Venezuela. Venezuela recibió ahí pobladores de todas partes del mundo y termino diciendo que hoy Venezuela, el día que recupere su democracia, el día que recupere su libertad, que sucederá, que recupere, a fin de cuentas, su república, verá la recuperación más espectacular, más inédita, histórica, que ha vivido Latinoamérica, porque tanto hubo capacidad para destruirla como tiene el país capacidad de resiliencia para ser reconstruida. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Let's hope that we see soon a free Venezuela, and we can go there to your country to celebrate. Now is the turn to David Kovel, please, from the United States.
Well, good morning. David Kovel from Kirby McInerney, and I guess I'm going to be talking about investments and how that has been affected by COVID in the United States, the capital markets. It feels a little incongruous talking about capital markets and following such a discussion about Venezuela. In the United States, there's been suffering too. The suffering, for the most part, did not occur in the capital markets. It's been a good year and a half for investors, strangely, and it's been a good year and a half for companies, many companies. I mean, just imagine if you had invested in Zoom in March of 2020. It's done quite well, and tech companies in general have been the highlights. Investors, and that's my job, is to look at capital markets on behalf of investors. They've done well. There have been some interesting developments because of COVID in the commodities and the capital markets nonetheless. Some of the interesting developments in commodities, I don't know if anyone remembers, but back in April of 2020, the price of oil, spot oil, West Texas Intermediate oil, went negative. I don't know if anyone can get their head around that, but it would pay you to take oil. I mean, it didn't make any sense. It went to negative $37 a barrel. And that was largely because of a trade war, or the cartel, Russia and Saudi Arabia, having a war about oil. And that affected pricing, but it also was impacted by the lack of demand from COVID, and then ultimately the failing of the commodity system, the exchange market, in tracking oil and allowing the price discovery mechanism to work well. There's been some litigation that has stemmed from that. Now in the commodities markets, the opposite is the case. The increased demand as the world comes out of COVID has created real bottlenecks in certain commodities, and litigation is likely to follow from that. So whether it's going to be successful or not is another question. Turning to the securities markets, a lot of the litigation that has come up in the context of securities and securities fraud has been along the lines of companies that either have been accused of not adequately disclosing the problems that COVID was having associated with their companies. The highlight for that would be the cruise lines, who suffered enormously and had real problems. They've been accused in the United States of having not disclosed the real extent of the problems that they would have with COVID. I don't know, in any of these cases how strong they are, but that's a large phenomenon sort of across the board in the securities fraud world. In addition, there are a series of cases involving companies that disclosed that they were going to make tons of money because of COVID, either because they had the be-all, end-all test, or they had the right vaccine, and maybe they didn't, and whether they knew or not that they didn't is the question of a lot of securities litigation right now. And that's something that's been brewing. None of these cases take a long time in the United States, so we don't know how they'll turn out. There is famously some companies that have fraudulently taken money from the United States government, and those cases are also wending their way through the court system. But on the whole, it's been a good time to have money in the United States if it's been invested in the capital markets. And that's in great contrast to some of the suffering that's occurred worldwide, and including in the United States from COVID. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, David. Now is the turn of Norma de Castro from Dominican Republic.
As a growing democracy, the Dominican Republic has been particularly struck by this COVID pandemic. And particularly in sections of the economy such as tourism and hospitality, which are key, we have been key to our development in the last few years. That is why the recent decision of a large company to require mandatory vaccination of its employees recently sparked a discussion in the Dominican Republic about whether this decision was legal or not. For some, our labor code, and particularly its Article 88.15, allows for the justified dismissal of workers who refuse to be vaccinated by stating as grounds for termination, which whenever the worker refuses to adopt preventive measures or to follow the procedures indicated by law, the competent authorities or their employers to avoid accidents or illnesses. Others, including myself, do not follow this argument thoroughly, since, as we will see later, there is not a mandatory, it is not yet mandatory to be vaccinated in our country, and the rights of workers normally prevail, particularly the principle in dubio pro operario, that forces to interpret in favor of workers any labor provision or conflict between such provisions. Therefore, such dismissal would be considered in principle as irregular or unjustified. From a labor standpoint, it is not possible then to terminate by way of dismissal, that is by claiming the violation of employment contract in the face of an employee's refusal to be vaccinated against COVID-19, and notwithstanding the obligation of security that the employer has in relation to other employees of the company. It should be noted that work relationships are not vertical, rather horizontal. Therefore, if there is no ground for dismissals for this reason, there will be no ground whatsoever if a worker is forced to work with someone that does not want to be vaccinated and refuses to work, at least in person, on such grounds. In our opinion, it will be enough or sufficient that our Ministry of Health declare the compulsory or mandatory nature of COVID-19 vaccination in accordance with Article 64 of our General Health Law. And I would add, within the framework of work and educational centers. In this case, we believe that the non-vaccination, the refusal to vaccination, will become grounds for dismissal. In the meantime, any employer is free, as it's always been, to terminate at will any employee. That is without alleging costs, provided that he pays the employee in question all his employment benefits and other compensation to which he is entitled. From a constitutional standpoint, however, I shall allow myself to say that Article 42 of our Constitution establishes the principle of the inviolability of the human body, the noli me tangere principle from the Roman times, when in the final part, it provided an exception to that rule by saying, except when your life is in danger, as it is understood to be the case with the COVID pandemic. It is important to say that our Constitutional Court has also allowed, in the similar case of anti-doping tests, to break this principle of the inviolability of the human body when reasons of national security are at stake. Finally, I would like to add that in some sense, the European Court of Human Rights recently, a couple of months ago actually, ruled as a result of the complaint raised by Czech's parents which were facing fines and the refusal of their children to be to not be accepted in nurseries, that it is that compulsory vaccination is necessary in any democratic society. And I believe that this should be the case in the Dominican Republic, even though to this date the government still refuses to provide such vaccination as mandatory. We do hope that it will do so in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman. Now one of the Austrian member of Eurolatam Lex and a partner, Harald Czermak, please.
I would like to give you a short example how the COVID situation influenced the process of legislation and how the necessity to find solutions speeded up even some process that started before. My example is the rules on meetings and, in effect, of valid resolutions of company organs. The ones easier to handle are the internal bodies of a company, for example, board of directors or the supervisory board. For these kind of gatherings, very soon it was stated that whatever the bylaws of the company say, the virtual meeting is sufficient for the gathering and for making decisions. The companies had a need to know how they can make valid decisions, and the government very easily answered virtual meetings are valid if all necessary persons are involved in the meeting, and there is a permanent two-way communication, which means online conferences with permanent two-way communications is sufficient to meet the needs for valid decisions. It got more complicated when they started to think what to do with annual meetings of shareholders. Now, the investors are involved, it's more to the public, and if you think of stock companies, public listed companies, where there are dozens, hundreds, even thousands of shareholders, it's not possible to do a virtual meeting. So the next step was the so-called hybrid meeting, which was set up by involving the companies, by involving interest groups, and there it was stated that a small group of people has to meet in person, which is basically member of the board, member of the supervisory board, and at least, and this was new, 4 special representatives had to be on place. These representatives had to be neutral from the company and had to receive instructions from the shareholders. So in advance, you could give them instructions how to vote, if to oppose to a resolution, and to ask questions. In addition to this, there had to be a permanent one-way communication, so the whole meeting has to be streamed. Every shareholder should be able to watch it, and there must be a permanent possibility to ask questions via email or a special platform so that the shareholders can be involved. For the companies, this was a quite easy way to keep their gatherings, to keep their annual meetings, but for the shareholders, of course, it was not the way before when you could put questions, uncomfortable questions, and ask for direct answers. Because here, you first send in your questions, the company reads out the question, and it's totally different than you can put it in person. So the process continued. It was a wider involvement of academic experts, of practitioners, of interest groups, and now I think it's almost reached the end to set up the next level, the so-called satellite meeting, which means there is like the hybrid meeting, one-way communication, special representative, small group, but there are satellite facilities where the shareholders can enlist in advance with a two-way communication, and from that point, you can ask your question directly, you can ask for the answer, you can ask extra questions, and then you can communicate. And I think this example shows that for a long time there was a discussion on virtual meetings, on digitalization, and the COVID situation, together with investors who want to invest more globally, who want to be part of the companies, ask questions, and even make them involve more. Interest rates going down, people getting more interest in stock market, it gives opportunity to get in contact with a company without being there in person, without traveling there. And I think this is one example how just the digitalization speeded up by the needs, by the necessity, and giving the investors an opportunity which was better than even perhaps before 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Harald. Now is your turn from Romania. for Florin Dobre. Welcome, please.
Buenos dias. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I would like to start by pointing out a few main figures regarding Romania and how COVID has affected our country. Basically, out of the total population of Romania of 19.5 million, we have 1 million confirmed cases and at present 4.5 million fully vaccinated people. So from the first sight of the pandemic, the Romanian government has taken strict and extraordinary measures to prevent the spread of the virus. I would like to mention an interesting aspect regarding the fact that Romania has chosen to trigger Article 15 of the European Convention on Human Rights, whereby the signatory states can derogate from the application of the provisions guaranteeing the protection of fundamental human rights. Moreover, during the state of emergency, or national lockdown, as known by everybody, there were, for the first time since the Romanian Revolution in 1999, military ordinances being issued. This put a lot of pressure on the Romanian population, bringing back some unpleasant memories from the communist era. Following that first severe months, Romania entered a state of alert, a set of measures more relaxed, flexible, state of alert which is still active today. Just to reflect a few of the main regulations impacting the citizens, in order to avoid the huge job loss, Romanian authorities have decided to provide up to 75% of the salaries for people sent to technical unemployment. Moreover, vulnerable categories of people are also protected and they receive up to 12 months of financial support. Online school was further developed and implemented. Telemedicine was brought up to speed and made sure that all people that were not affected by COVID were also being taken care of. When it comes to the business environment, access to loans were facilitated by the Romanian government by securing the loans that were provided by the private financial institutions. Whereas on the ongoing loans, they set up a 9 months moratorium to ease the repayment. A deferral of payment for all taxes, social contribution, and VAT was put in place and proved to be very favorable for the economic environment. I would like to conclude on a positive note, mentioning that, as David pointed out as well, online services and digitalization flourished in Romania as well. In April 2020, we had our first online trial. And at current, most of the communication, the public authorities, is done online via various platforms. Thank you so much for your attention.
Now, we're going to connect with Fabiana Menichetti from Italy.
Good morning.
Good morning, Fabiana.
Good morning to
Go
everyone.
ahead.
Okay, today I would like to talk about the measures that the Italian government took to support citizens and companies. From my point of view, that it's really similar to Mr. De Castro view, the Dominican Republic lawyer, because I would like to see the situation from the perspective of a labor and employment lawyer. Okay, let's start from the reference framework. As many of you may know, Italy was the first Western country to be heavily affected by COVID-19 and to face this pandemic. Italy declared a national state of emergency on January 31. The state of emergency is still in force and it should expire on July 31, but an extension will be sure, in our opinion. And we entered a nationwide lockdown on March 11. what did the Italian government do when we entered the lockdown? In my opinion, the biggest measures taken by our government were three: remote working, wage guarantee fund, and ban of dismissals. Let's see how they worked. Okay, as much as regard remote working, in Italy we call it smart working. The government strongly recommended to all companies to allow their employees to work from remote. When we were in lockdown, it means at home. Okay. Remote working is generally regulated by a law of 2017, but the government established that its provisions were suspended, and they are still suspended. So we are using remote working with no formalities in this moment. The second big measure was wage guarantee fund. Is a typical Italian instrument. It is a fund to support companies that have to suspend or reduce their activities and to supplement employees' earnings. And so how did it work? For people who could work at home, we use remote working. For people who couldn't work at home, for example, blue collars, we use wage guarantee funds. And then in any case, the government stated the ban of dismissals. What does it mean? This means that the company could not proceed with collective or individual dismissals for economic reasons. This ban is still in force. So Italian companies cannot dismiss employees for economic reasons, and it will be in force until, in this moment, the government said until 31 of October for fashion sector, that, as you know, is one of our excellence in the world, fashion sector, and also retail, and also textiles. So these are the three sectors that for whom there is also the ban of dismissal. This strategy worked very well last year. It is still working. And actually, it's not possible to foresee which will be the future, what will happen in the future, for as much as regard our employment perspective. But I think that the government did well. It was a good strategy for the Italian situation. I would like to reply to Mr. De Castro that was talking about the situation of the vaccines, because we took a decision about the mandatory vaccination, and on April of this year, the Italian government make vaccinations against COVID-19 mandatory. So there is a decree that make coronavirus vaccines mandatory for only for the healthcare workers. But it means for workers who are working in public or private social health positions. What happens if the workers refuse to get vaccinated? Actually, they can be transferred to another job without risk of spreading infections, or if there is no job to give them, they are suspended with no payment until the end of 2021. So it is a strange situation, because now we have 500 healthcare workers that have lodged a legal challenge against the requirement that they get vaccinated. So the first hearing will be the 14th of July, so we will see what will happen. But I agree with the Dominican Republic colleague, because it is a very discussed topic. So I don't know if you...
Thank you very much, Fabiana. Now is the turn for Mark Northway. He's the chairman of the World Federation of Investors from the United Kingdom. Hello, Mark. Go ahead, Mark. Mark, can you hear us? Please go ahead.
Yeah, your mic, the the microphone was off. Okay, yes, ladies and gentlemen, can you hear me? Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today, and I apologize for being unable to attend in person. The World Federation of Investors is an umbrella organization encompassing national shareholder associations from across the globe. My comments are from a lay perspective. I'm not a lawyer. We're proud to count AMEC, the Spanish Shareholders Association, as an active member, and we are hugely grateful for the continuous support of the law firm Cremades y Calvo Sotelo. I'm asked to provide an international view of the effects of COVID and COVID-related regulation on investors. And to echo David Kovel's comments, very fortunately, the effects of the pandemic on savers and investors to date have been far less catastrophic than we might reasonably have expected. In some instances, the regulatory response has actively contributed to that positive outcome, while in other areas it has left much to be desired. The primary impacts of COVID-related regulation from the perspective of the minority investor have been in the areas of corporate governance, capital adequacy, and insolvency protection. As regards corporate governance, the focus of regulatory intervention has been to ensure the ability of companies to fulfill their obligations to shareholders without the need for physical general meetings. As outlined by Harald Czermak, Austria in particular has led from the front with its efforts to maintain a regime as close as possible to pre-COVID. Around the world, temporary legislation has allowed a spectrum of solutions from closed general meetings through one-way webcasts to full online participation, and technical solutions have moved fast to facilitate the latter. The general meeting is a critical component of corporate governance. It's the primary check and balance over the fiduciary activities of the board of directors of a company. The stewardship process relies on the reports, questions and answers, and shareholder voting at the general meeting to hold directors to account. In the words of the UK's Financial Reporting Council, all shareholders should have the ability to hear from the board before voting on resolutions. Therefore, it is best practice for companies to make every effort to ensure that shareholders should have the ability to vote following presentations from the board. Some of the currently permitted options do not make this possible. The response of companies themselves has been mixed, with some choosing to engage, inform, and involve minority shareholders, but others taking the opportunity to actively and intentionally reduce shareholder influence. In the UK, the Individual Investor Association, ShareSoc, which I also chair, maintains a section of its website entitled Leaders and Laggards, which highlights this dispersion of behaviour under the regulations. A notable positive example is the dual-listed company BHP. As regards capital adequacy, the main issues have naturally related to regulated financial service providers, banks and insurance companies, where national regulatory authorities have prudently anticipated the tsunami of COVID-related loan losses and claims, which again, fortunately, has largely failed to materialise. Here, our concern has been the wide variety of measures, and particularly the restrictions on the payment of dividends. In many jurisdictions, the regulatory reaction has been measured and calm, attempting to balance the interests of shareholders, employees, and customers. But in others, such as Slovenia, the provisions have caused real harm to end investors. There is a corollary in the behaviour of the companies themselves, not limited to the financial sector. Many issuers have clearly attempted to maintain dividend flow to the extent it is prudent to do so. But regrettably, some have been remarkably enthusiastic at cutting off that dividend flow, which is the lifeblood of the pensioners and savers on their share registers. The final key element of the other key element of capital adequacy is capital raising. Here, our concern has been the temporary suspension or amendment of preemption rights, coupled, at least in Europe, with the prospectus regulation. Throughout the pandemic, there have been too many instances of heavily discounted placements, often into speculative trading hands at the cost of significant dilution for excluded minority holders. This unacceptable behaviour damages confidence and reduces loyalty. Finally, as regards insolvency protection, the temporary COVID measures have generally been favourable to minority shareholders. The ability for directors to continue trading while insolvent, combined with increased protection from creditors and enhanced tenancy rights, have allowed shareholders to remain in the game for longer than would otherwise have been the case, and in many cases to reap the benefits of the recovery. These measures have proven effective and in many cases have produced positive outcomes for shareholders, creditors, employees, and customers alike. Overall, the response to the pandemic by regulators and companies has been measured and responsible. The experience has forced high-level regulatory experiments, and we now need to use the feedback from those experiments and their supporting technology to further improve and strengthen the investment ecosystem for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. And now from Cambodia, Siphana Sok is going to join the conversation.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Go ahead.
Well, yes, thank you. You know, the situation in Cambodia, it's a bit very different than in Europe, because last year we did very well because there was no death, there was no not much infection. You know, for a population of 16 million, we have like 500 or 600 infection. But then early this year, we have a major super spreader that really sort of like provoke a big community outbreak. So now we have a total about 56,000 infected out of a population of 16 million. Yeah? And out of that, we have like 48,000 people recovered. So it's not so bad. It's not so bad from the health perspective. But from the economic perspective, it's quite devastating because, as you know, some of you may know that Cambodia tourism industry is big time. You know, we have the seventh wonder of the world, so tourists, 5 or 6 million tourists fly to a temple to visit it. But the town is become a ghost town now, so it really affects the tourism industry. And the government has been quite forceful to come up with some measure to help them. But still, you know, at the end of the day, you need real customer. You cannot live on government subsidy. The government has been very, very sort of like pay a lot of attention to the garment industry also, the footwear and the garment industry. You know, because our country, we have about 800,000 worker, mostly women worker, who work in the garment and the footwear industry. And the COVID is really disrupting the supply chain and also the impact on the workforce is quite dramatic. Yeah? What the government did in the early part of last year was to introduce an emergency law. In fact, it was well taken because in Cambodia we used to sort of like this dramatic measure, you know, like 2-3 decades ago we had a genocide. So now the people really rely on the government to step in and to take care, to help them. You know, so there was no reaction from the emergency measure, but basically what the measure is to allow the government to take a measure like the lockdown, that sort of thing, you know, safe distancing, you know, COVID testing, that sort of thing. So the population react quite well, and at one point we even had the military to step in to help with the vaccination, because we realized that the civilian medical facility are not enough to cover the effort to vaccinate the people. And again, on the vaccination side, there was no law to say that it's mandatory or not mandatory, but the government position is that we want to vaccinate as many people as possible. So I think by now, out of the population, the adult population, about 10 million, we have vaccinated about 44% of the people already. So and we continue to vaccinate as much as we can with the amount of vaccine we could get. I think that's from the health and the regulation side. From the private sector side, it's quite interesting because we start to react quite early. That at the end of the day, business have to go on. There'll be many diversion of industry. Like for example, people who used to run a hotel industry start to shift to e-commerce, start to shift to online business, that sort of thing. And for example, in our commercial arbitration center, we start to introduce measures that enable arbitrator to hold hearing, online hearing, hybrid hearing, that sort of thing. So I think all in all, I think we are reacting well from the COVID, from the policy perspective, from the regulation perspective. There's no backfiring. People appreciate the fact that the government is doing what it can. Right? I mean, let's face it, we are not a rich country, but the amount of resource, finance that the Ministry of Finance is putting in place to help the victim is quite amazing. So it does drain a budget, but it's something quite exceptional that we have to appreciate that, right? So all in all, I think we are bracing for the variant, which causing a big havoc. So we are really worried about that. But all in all, I think I would say Cambodia is faring quite well from that. So we hope that we can contain the epidemic, and the pandemic, Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you all the panelists from a wide variety of countries now, and for sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your experiences trying to tackle this terrible pandemic. And now I pass the floor to Kim Kovel, the Executive Vice President of the World Jurist Association.